But in terms of my mother, no, she taught me how to make a little hat similar to this, because in World War II, soldiers wore hats like that, and I was a child, and she was busy with her sewing, and I got in the way, so she taught me how to sew a little bit on the sewing machine to make those. So I had my own military hats, which were flowered. I was always involved in art, so there was no single decision in that sense. I was going to go to the university anyway, whatever, and they taught art in the university. Art schools, per se, didn't really attract me in particular. The idea of universities, and I'm still that way, because I believe in a comprehensively educated person, And I like the big libraries in universities because anything I'm curious about, I can find, and that's my attraction. You can say, though, naturally, as the years evolved from 1955 to 60, I became more artistic and understood more what art could be compared to when I went in. In other words, a person at age 18 is a young person. By 22 or 3, well, you should have, matured enough, and I had pushed the sports part of me aside, and the art had taken over. At the same time, I'm just as curious as always about geography, geology, history, all of those things. Yes, art was painting. Art wasn't sculpture. When you're a kid and you come home from school to show your mother something, it's not sculpture. It's a drawing or a painting or something like that. Sculpture showed up because you had to take it as one of the things that introduced you to art in the university. But then I wasn't any more attracted to it. I was curious, but that part wasn't what put me into making sculpture the way I evolved later. That happened because I was taking a required sculpture class, and I happened to see a couple of graduate students welding, and I got curious about that. And I got one of them to teach me the basics of welding, oxyacetylene welding. As I said, I was an undergrad, they were graduate, and often, at least one of them, maybe both, they were sort of apprentice teachers, for the real sculptor teacher, which was a man named Hal Gebhardt, very good sculptor. The closest thing, without being specific, was somewhere in the Henry Moore idea of form and stuff like that. Very good teacher, very good artist. Anyway, I got curious, and if that was 1960, 59 or 60, I didn't, and then I left school in 60. I didn't graduate then, but I left school. And, I was making art, and I was painting all the time. Painting was, as I say, I was a painter, very simple. But I started to make constructions in wood and stuff, things that were close to the ideas that existed in the abstract things that were welded, in the world. And then I decided, because the University of Southern California wasn't far away from where I lived, so I took a night class so I could use their welding equipment, and I could do anything I wanted. They didn't care. And after about 3 or 4 weeks, I said, I've got to get my own equipment. So I went and laid out the money for some my own welding equipment, put it in the garage, and from then on I made, my own stuff in my own place. And within about 3 years, I had stopped making paintings. And in '63 is when the first of the lynch fragments showed up. And that really came out of the idea of experimenting with abstract form with steel. And then all of a sudden, something was fitting between what I thought sociopolitically and in terms of art. And the way it was fitting was unusual, as far as I knew, and it certainly was unusual enough to be interesting to me. And so the first of the lynch fragments showed up, the one that later on I gave the name Some Bright Morning, you know. And naturally, when you feel good about one thing you've done, you try and do variations on it, and that basically was that part of the story. The other aspect is, well, you can't just make small reliefs. That's, you know. And I don't know where I lost it, but I wrote out a paper based on really determining what was the difference in sculpture and painting. Naturally, it's three-dimensional, but what did that imply compared to painting? And I don't remember the details, but it's, of course, the differences are clear. You just can't do with painting what you can do with sculpture, and you can't do with sculpture what you can do with painting, you know. But sculpture has the application of existing anywhere in the space of the world, or if we take gallery space as the metaphor of the limits of space for art, the walls, the floor, and the ceiling are places work can go and come from. I draw all the time, but not for specific pieces. The only time something similar to that comes about is if I'm working on a commission. Because with commission, somebody else has to look at and kind of see, are we thinking the way we discussed when we discussed the possibility of the commission? You know, because I don't propose the commissions, somebody else does. And if we agree, and usually what I do, it's not necessarily then drawings, even. I'm more apt to make a half a dozen small pieces and see which one we agree on. And if we agree, then I'll do drawings for not for how it will appear as much as for the fabricator, so the details of how many inches this way, how many feet that way, you know, what's the nature of a particular curve, things like that. Because those things for fabrication, like architecture, have to be specific, you know. So first of all, they are materials, you know. Most people as viewers see objects, that's what they recognize. You know, it's like language. If you're in a room and everybody's speaking Chinese and there's nothing but noise. You know, if you speak Chinese, people are talking. It's the same sounds, but it's the capacity to recognize. In terms of the fact that I go to the scrapyard to find steel. People, they get excited because they know objects show up in my work. So they presume I'm looking for objects and stuff. I'm usually most happy, to tell the truth, when I find some geometric scrap cut off that I can make into something. I may make it look like something that people recognize. And often people think something there is found and it's something I made completely. You know, they're the hammers that I took a hammerhead off of a hammer. But there are any number of sculpture with hammer kind of forms, and I made them totally. You know, nobody asks; they just presume it's a hammer, and that, you know, the nature of the materials, the implications of the lives that they, as instruments or things, that's fine with me. You know, that's like poetry. A word is one thing because somebody understands the words around it. The same word can mean other things because somebody doesn't understand its place in the conversation. And that's like color. If I have a big canvas and I put a spot of red paint there, that's one thing. But if I happen to have drawn a human figure there and put a blob of red paint, people think blood right away. It's red paint. But how humans think and communicate, it's a part of the game, if you will. When I say the game, the dynamics that I'm putting and the dynamics that their experience allows them to comprehend or to guess, because you don't have to be right to appreciate, and I don't have to be right to make it. Barbed wire was to keep the cows at home. If you don't remember the real original reason for the material, because there are a lot of other human experiences that include that material, The easiest one for most people in the 20th century is the concentration camps. Everybody presumes concentration camps were all barbed wire. The truth is, many of them weren't at all. But they were camps of concentration, But barbed wire, it's a resistance. The barb is there to remind animals and people they should not go that way, And personal reason that, if not reason, the personal thought that came to me as I started to see it as a usable material was my cousins teasing me when I was a kid going to the country to visit them and to go out of the area around the house into the fields. You had to go through the barbed wire fences. And I was always tearing my, clothes because I wasn't used to doing it. And my cousins used to laugh at me, especially the younger ones, because a younger one who can tease a big boy, So, but as a material, it's linear, so if you will, the idea of drawing and in space, which is what sculpture is about, it provides a different kind of line, Very simply, the two kinds of lines most expressed here are by two flexible materials in steel, but differently flexible, and therefore differently capable of insinuating things, or doing things, if you will, The implication on this one where there's a lock, that just becomes symbolic, and I didn't put the lock there, but I put the piece together because I recognize that it holds a meaning of a kind that I've often used, so why not, Much of the world is made of steel, so there's apt to be a lot of scrap. And scrap steel at 10 cents a pound is much better than new steel at $2 a pound. So, naturally, any place you work has some effect, or live, So if there's corrosion here, it's because of the caipirinhas. Don't cut this out. But no, the environment that you work naturally affects. On the other hand, it may not show up visibly. I was very comfortable working here, comfortable in the sense that worker to worker, the people at Mauricio's welding place was very natural. We got along well. If I said something and I didn't know linguistically the right words, I could point and play a little with my hands, and he would know what I meant. It was very easy because, you can go past language very quick when you're doing things and you need to understand the doing. You understand the doing before you understand the linguistic correctness of how to direct the person to help you. Well, it's one more form that people recognize, and at the same time have some sense that if they see a ladder in an unusual place, it must mean something else, and not just what a ladder ordinarily means. In essence, the theme, which comes from the slogan of the resistance in various Portuguese colonies in Africa, a luta continua, and personages like Amilcar Cabral were significant in the writing and speaking, about that period in history. While it was going on, I did get to see Amilcar Cabral once in New York when he came to talk. As the United Nations is in New York, a lot of people from a lot of places in the world come for many different reasons. But I did get to see him at a small gathering of people, and was very impressed by him. Not a large man or anything like that, but just so purely sensible that he was very impressive for me. I knew of various people from many of the Portuguese colonies or former colonies in the world. This theme, a luta continua, is not specific about how the struggle can continue. And I felt that culturally or aesthetically, there was a place for what I did, and not necessarily about those particular places, because, as I say, Cabral was functioning in the world of the Portuguese colonial system. I just, if you will, took on the whole world in relation to Africa and Africans and what had been imposed in the last 500 years. It gave me a lot of territory, a lot of material to work with, a lot of room to be inventive. And so variations on that idea, the idea of being inventive, is the basis for the room, and it's a basis for me as well, Only, I wouldn't call it advice. They have to find their own way. This is a personal search driven by the internal, needs of the person who's doing it. I presume they studied art, and they study the world that they live in, and then think and do, And if you want to compare with what others have done, that's fine, but it's most important to think and do yourself and understand that it can take a long time, that it's not a career, and I say it that way because the word wasn't kicked around in art when I was young. I don't mean that the world should be like it was when I was young, but I think that was one of the things you didn't have to think about it. You didn't have no fucking career, excuse the expression, but you wanted to make art. I want to make art, and I still want to do that, and I still do it. That's why when people are surprised that I can do this amount of work in a couple of weeks, probably could double it. If it was organized a bit more my way, and stuff. But of course, I procrastinate just like everybody. I don't always work. I go in the studio and goof off, if you will, listen to the radio, or just go sit down outside and say, I don't feel like doing anything now. But when I'm ready to work, I work, and that's what I think a person ought to do. If the word work took the place of the word art, what people would produce would be quite different.